So I'll just begin. This is a photo of Nishi Hoodake. And I'd be, if I'm going to talk about beauty, I need to quote my wife that nothing the human being can imagine will even come close to nature in its production of beauty. And we should just give up trying to imitate it, even to learn from it. This is just a quote from my wife. I should just stop there. I think that was pretty good.
Let's discuss. Once you said that, what's your theory of mediation?
Okay, I still hear myself, but that's okay. I've changed my title slightly, well, considerably. There's no thread in it. The thread's still there, but not in the title anymore. So it's Nakai Dialectical Subjectivity, the Art of Living Life, and the creating of history. I just like to go through titles. I'm not very good at them. Before I start, I'd like to say, again, thank you for everybody for being here. And I've been learning a great deal. I usually ask a lot more questions. I think everyone will tell you that I usually ask like tons of questions, and this time I haven't because I've just been like, oh my God, I know nothing. These people are like specialists, and I'm feeling seriously out of my league again, which is fine. Also, my style of philosophy is rather different, and what I'm trying to do with Nakai is maybe very different. And so please bear with me if I'm saying things that don't really make a lot of sense. As Jim says, the wall probably hits us at about halfway through my talk. Nakai's aesthetics is a social political theory of the collective art of living life as life. Art is the dialectical medium and dialogical means of the collective expression of life. It is a creative mechanism of the self-transformation of life. The artists create beautiful things, but in so doing, they create different kinds of beauty. However, the spectator and the materiality of the work contribute to the creative process, and therefore can also be said to be artists in their own right. For Nakai, beauty is an expression of logos as a unique moment within the kairos of history. And when a new beauty is born, there must also be a new fundamental form of historical life, and with it, a historical world. The absolute whole, Nakai writes, emerges from somewhere, and the individual person, as a part of the whole, is forced to accept what she or he is without realizing it. It is the new flower that awakens within us, precisely at the moment we discover as a germ and a turning point, the path shining through all that stands opposed to us. At the heart of this is Nakai's understanding of dialectical subjectivity as a creative process of transformation, always redefining itself in the moment of opposition through the mediation of its own negation, always to be in becoming and never to be. For Nakai, in the experience of beauty, I encounter a self that I did not yet know, a self that I did not anticipate, a self that is deeper or more penetrating, like a wave breaking on the ocean, a self that is newer than the self I thought I was before. This way of understanding existence, this negotiation with oneself, this is our world of beauty and our world of art. For Nakai, the consciousness of spatial and temporal distance within the world is, at the deepest level, an awareness of the distance that separates us from ourselves, the closest yet infinite distance between us and ourselves. Now, be it the interdisciplinary journals of beauty and criticism or world culture, the weekly populist music newspaper Doyobi, the collective public protests, the collective activity of producing films, the cafe is a mobile site of transformative public discourse of resistance, the Hope Concert, the Summer University project of collective imminent self-critique, the Hiroshima cultural movement of peace and democracy as a collective movement seeking a new way of life, the establishment of the library as a transformative medium of democratic thinking, In all of these, Nakai's philosophical focus was on the objective mechanisms or organizations, the kiko, that create and mediate a collective embodied subjectivity. And his social activism focused on the creation of new mechanisms or organizations of collective embodied subjectivity that would be cognizant of the mechanisms that condition their subjectivity, while at the same time co-creating these very mechanisms or organizations in collaboration with others. For Nakai, the group is never a homogeneous substance of the romantic blood and soil, but the interconnection of many creative individuals, the many as an organized cosmos in which there is a reciprocal control among elements, the bidirectionality of action. Nakai examines how the nature of the collective embodied subjectivity is transformed as the material medium of thought historically shifts. A true cooperative of the bidirectional creative transformation cannot be achieved without practicing, emphasis here on practicing, as such a revolution, or better, a conversion in consciousness. If we want to change politics, we must transform the institutions of culture. If we are to transform the institutions of culture, we must transform ourselves. And this requires a collective act of self-critique, which Nakai called the Salon of the Soul. Nakai's entire social political project was to overcome the capitalist ego of modernity that only sees the world from the economy of its own perspective, and to return us to that despite everything, to remind us that despite everything, the laughter of the Bodhisattva is still alive in us today. Now, in his 1932 essay, The Continuity of Spring, Nakai provides a detailed analysis of the technique of the cut and montage in Kaufman's film Spring, and writes, "The history of language, which has been transformed into the spoken word, written word, printed word, and the telegraphic word, has now entered the realm of the language of sight, which does not require translation into any national language. It can be said that we now have a language without grammar, that is, a connection without copula, and without ending, that is to say, without telos." Now, we find here the beginnings of the critical treatment of the historical transition of logic that is the main focus of the logic of the committee. Each material medium of logos possesses its own logic that conditions the historical event of worlding opened up through it, and the embodied subjectivity that inhabits this historical event of worlding. The Greek world was a phonic-centered, the medieval graphic-centered, the modern world print and telegraphic-centered. Nakai's world was that of the cut and the montage, the utsutsu of the schematic image of history. At the heart of utsutsu lies the problem of continuity and discontinuity. It is continuous in the sense that it is an equivocal relation, but discontinuous in the sense that it is separate into two places. Seeing itself must be a continuity of discontinuity. One of the dominant themes of Nakai's thought is the problem of continuity and discontinuity. Following Kassir and Cohen, Nakai argues that the symbolic function possesses the dynamic meaning of continuous disconnection and serves as a medium for the mechanical continuity, that is, the disconnection of space and time as the equivalent relation of time. Nakai's philosophy challenges and goes beyond Derrida's claim about the dominance of phonocentrism. In his work on avant-garde films, Nakai examines the new medium from the perspective of a new logic of the image without copula, as the new kinosatz, the language of cinema, and the new technique of the cut and montage that define for Nakai the emergent art form of avant-garde film as the inherently anti-fascist and anti-capitalist medium. Though we speak of the historically embodied medium, the medium of the world, what is critical for Nakai is that the medium of the world becomes the means of worlding. For Nakai, the medium is an inherently closed system in which things exist. whereas the means are the modes of creative expression by which a world whirls, and thus, as infinitely creative, form an inherently open-ended and non-complete system, and not simply an incomplete system. Incomplete would be something that could, in principle, be complete. This is a non-complete system. For Kassir, the symbolic forms of culture are the means of worlding and the medium of the historical world. Yes, we are in language. Language is the medium of thought. But we think only by bringing language to language, by speaking. And in this way, we transform the medium into the means of expression that create the medium of language itself. We can use language only by working on it, and every speech act transforms the language it speaks of and with. Nakai's critique of Nishida is that the theory of Basho remains a theory of the medium, but not a theory of the means. In other words, Nakai's functionalist theory of the organization as a transformative mechanism marks a transition from understanding actuality in terms of a place, Basho, to understanding it in terms of work, Werken, or the function. The players on the field, the rowers in the boat, the lens of the camera, the university, in short, the committee, is not a place where things happen, but the flow of work or function as a living organization. The very organization or mechanism that support the realities of life cannot be based on a place-like approach. They must shift to a functional way of thinking, that is, to a work-based approach, in order for these organizations to be able to function. Work here, of course, is understood as Werken. For Nakai, the everyday is not Heidegger's impersonal, anonymous, and average mode of existence. Rather, it is the unique historical site of a transformative social political praxis. In picking up the chopsticks, I open up the world. Here, there is a kata to cooking a meal and a kata for eating a meal. It should be emphasized here that in Japanese culture, at least for Nakai, the borderlines between philosophy, religion, art, and the everyday are blurred. Aesthetics is about a way of life as the art of living. Nakai's work on aesthetics must be approached with this in mind. In the early 30s, Nakai was working on a theory of collective thinking and action as a collective resistance against the rise of Japanese fascism on the one hand and European-style capitalism on the other. For Nakai, expression, perception, thinking, and action are displaced from a substantial notion of an autonomous individual consciousness and embodied in a collective cooperative structure that includes the body and nature, but also group sports, architectural spaces, the lens of the camera, and other mechanisms as extensions of what he calls, following Kant and Kassir, the technology of nature. As Kassir writes, there's a technology of nature that is the expression of a creative formative will. Now, in his 1927 article on the preface of Kant's Third Critique, Nakai compares the two versions of the preface of the Critique of Judgment. In the first unpublished version, Kant situates technology as the medium between theory, the first critique, knowledge, and practice, the second critique, action. Technology is a dialectical moment, a reflective relation in the production of the historical forms by the productive imagination that mediates theory and practice through a world schema that forms a worldview of an epoch. A worldview is never something that is simply observed as it is. Rather, it is imitated and created. The power of the imagination, or the power of cognitively constructing, framing, building, is actually a kind of figurative appearance. The worldview of Kant's era unfolded as if it were a principle of this new attitude towards the world. In my translation of this quote, I've translated the first two sets of kanji, which are often translated both as the power of imagination. The second one is, of course, the kanji that is used with Mickey's The Logic of the Imagination. And by doing this, unpacking it this way, I'm trying to show the relationship between the power of the imagination as understood in Kant and the power of what I'm translating here is the cognitively constructing, framing, and building, which is unpacking these kanji and what they mean, and trying to show the relationship between them. By translating sugata as a figurative appearance, I'm bringing to attention the fact that the sugata is an ancient word for Buddha and is a key term, I think, both in aesthetics, but certainly in the Kyoto school, you find it used quite a bit in Nishitani, and very specifically when he's talking about a figure that represents the Sunata. With Kasir, Nakai understands the imagination as the root of our cognitive activity of building, dwelling, and thinking. However, the power of this constructing, framing, and building, as well as its products, the worldview as world schema, are themselves figurative appearances that are, as such, empty of self-being. Now, what Nakai calls a dialectical subjectivity mediates the epistemological subject, the shutan, and the embodied subject of action, the shutai. The dialectical subjectivity is a creative process that is made possible by self-relational negativity. It grasps the creative act in a mode of creation itself. The creative formative will is not found in nature. It is nature. It is the historical world, and the creative individual is a co-creative element of nature and the creative historical world. The world is a product of the reciprocal interconnection of individuals who must negate themselves to be part of a single world. This negation, however, is the internal limitation of my own freedom that forms the recognition of the other. For Nakai, the coexistence of contradiction is the meaning of critique, and the systematic organization of the three critiques of Kant express the cultural forms of such a contradiction. The development of the logic of experience in the first critique and the preparation for the ground for the logic of action in the second critique are the reflections of a particular economic situation in Germany at the time. And the third critique stands as a dialectical mediation between the contradictions of these first two movements, and therefore is Kant's times. Nakai develops his understanding of technology as a philosophy of the mechanisms that dialectically mediate nature and the human, the individual and the historical event of worlding. In the logic of the committee, Nakai writes, this human purposeful action sways nothingness into being, all being into nothingness, in order to combine them into a human sequential order in a schematic access of this natural sequence. The mediating moment that sways nothingness into being into nothingness, is the logic, the structure of the logic of technology. Through the dialectical creative mediation of technological transformation, the human separates itself from the animal world and forms the human world. It's in this way, the human itself, as one of the powers of nature, confronts material nature by means of the natural power in his body, as well as by means of the active force of intellectual work. The human works on nature, and in so doing transforms nature, thereby simultaneously transforming his own nature at the same time. Nakai's philosophy seeks to establish the aesthetic mechanism of presencing of nature, physis, and the cosmos as that mediates, transforms, and embodies the collective will to see in the originary phenomena of the creative activity of art as poiesis and techne. That is, the creative activity at work in the artwork that opens the event of worlding. A comparison of Nakai's view on technology with those of Nishida and Miki is beyond the scope of this paper. Nishida and Miki developed their theories of technology as an embodied logic of mediation in the mid to late 30s, and the similarities between their respective conceptions of mediation and technology have raised debates about who influenced whom. Like Nakai in the early 30s, Nishida and Miki maintained that we cannot separate poiesis, making, and physis, nature, and argued that the human creativity takes place through the technology of nature. Nishida wrote in 1936, technology is an activity of nature. Nature is an ingenious technician. Accordingly, we cannot accomplish anything unless it is thoroughly through the technology of nature, end quote. And Mickey wrote in 1936 that the Einbildungskraft in art corresponds to the technology of nature, end quote. Now, the move from the individual consciousness to an embodied collective consciousness, from the modern culture of individualism to the rising culture of collectivism, had thrown aesthetics, which had long been founded on the creative genius of an individual author, into crisis. Creativity now comes about into interaction of individuals, the rugby players creating a work of art, as an example. Whereas many bemoaned the end of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, Nakai embraced the poetic force of technology and the beauty of the machine. Nakai's Art of Tendencies in the Time of Intellectual Crisis was published in 1932, and The Logic of the Committee and Walter Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction were both published in 1936. Despite their differences, both understood human experience to be formed, configured, and organized by different historical forms of material, technical, and discursive mediation that are transformed through history as history. And for both, the work of art was the essential transformative medium and means of historical event of worlding. Nakai understood technology as a poetic and dialectical mediation between the human and nature, and the means of forming a historical event of worlding. Unsurprisingly, Nakai is sometimes called the Walter Benjamin of Japan. Nakai sets out his theory of mediation through a genealogy of the epistemes and the technologies of the self, to speak with Foucault. For example, the rise of the technique of paper and printing, which was a response to the development of economic trade, gave rise to the modern subject that is free to interpret language according to their individual historical situatedness. This leads to a new understanding of the human as an autonomous individual and to the state of nature in which the human being is a wolf to other human beings. People accustomed to the subservience within the feudal system must have had to cleanse themselves of something absorbed in their blood to convince themselves that they were one person, one individual person, and could interpret the words as they pleased. However, at the same time, there is a form of alienation here because they were unable to recognize that the idea that the human being is a wolf to other human beings is a mode of relation that arises from the terrifying structure of their own mechanical mechanism of industrial production that they had themselves that they too tell themselves that human beings were this way by nature. Repeatedly, we see that the source of alienation stems from the fact, as Nakai writes, that we are deeply involved in a mechanism we create but cannot understand. However, while we are assujettés in and through technology, we can also be the subjects of technology. By transforming the medium into a means, we move from the projected to the projecting, from the created to the creating. Nakai's philosophy has its roots in Kant, Hegel, Cassirer, Heidegger, Marx, Lenin, Nishida, Tanabe, Miki, Tosaka, Itagaki, and Pure Land Buddhism. The aesthetics of the new Saklikite, Nakai explicitly situates his entire philosophical project between Cassirer's transcendental critique of symbolic forms and Heidegger's existential analytic of Dasein. When substance concepts have been replaced by the function concepts, as Cassirer does in his 1910 work Substance and Function, two paths open to resolving the opposition between subjectivity and objectivity. The one taken by Cassirer in the direction of mathematization, and the other taken by Heidegger in the direction of the vital concrete hermeneutical phenomena. Although Nakai recognizes the diametrical and antithetical opposition between these two directions taken by Cassirer and Heidegger, he nevertheless not only argues that a continuous curvature seems to flow between them, but also suggests that Cassirer and Heidegger were aware of this and sought to move closer to the extreme opposite of their own positions. Thus, Cassirer, beginning from the numerical rigor, descends to concrete life, whereas Heidegger, beginning from the self-illumination of concrete life itself, tried to ascend to the essential structure. As a side note, before I discovered Japanese philosophy, my project was called The Cultural Event, which attempted to reconcile Cassirer and Heidegger through Derrida. Everywhere I went, I was told that I was trying to paint a round circle, a round square. And of course, you can imagine my surprise when I discovered Japanese philosophy and found out that, a whole series of thinkers were trying to reconcile the two hermeneutical frameworks of Cassirer and Heidegger. You see this in Nishida, who explicitly says that the challenge of philosophy today, or the task of philosophy, is to reconcile transcendental philosophy with Leibniz philosophy. You see this in Tanabe, you see this in Miki, you see this in Nakai, and you see this in Nishitane. This is the space where the Japanese philosophy of this period is situated. It's between these two hermeneutical circles. So you can imagine my excitement that I wasn't crazy. I might still be crazy, but not for the reasons that people were telling me. Nakai's entire philosophical project can be understood, as he says, in finding the Ariander's thread that connects the functionality of the transcendental form of worlding with the facticity of existence, the dialectical relation between the kata and the originary existence. This, I would argue, is the ultimate significance of aesthetic function for Nakai, in that it provides the deep correspondence between the functionality and the actual existence. We are brought back here to the function of the utsutsu, whose mobile meaning can never be present, because utsutsu itself is the mechanism of immediate presencing. The space and process of the productive imagination forming the world schema. As such, it can never be seen because it is the movement of immediate seeing itself. Central to Nakai's work is his reading of Cassirer's Substance and Function, 1910. With Cassirer, Nakai sees the Aristotelian theory of substance and concept formation as leading to the inherent dualism and abstractions of rational metaphysics in a traditional empiricism, and the substance concepts on which this theory of concept formation is based led to the logic of life and blood and soil of German Romanticism and nationalistic fascism. Drawing from the modern mathematics, Cassirer explains concept formation from the perspective of the function concept. The concept is a function that provides the rule of progression that transforms elements into a series of members of a unity. Cassirer generalizes decadence function relation into a relation of the symbolic function as the different modes of world forming. The form of the function is nothing more than the mapping relation in which one thing reflects another thing. The symbolic function is a particular kind of identity that attributes to otherwise heterogeneous figures in virtue of their being transformable into one another by means of a certain operation defining a group. Cassirer calls this the originary relationship that can be expressed in different formulations as the relationship between form and content, the relationship of universal to individual, as the relationship of validity to being. It is the strictly unitary relationship of opposing elements, a dialectical unity, a coexistence of contraries, as Cassirer repeatedly says. As Nakai points out, an abstraction theory of concept formation can only provide us with a set of individual representations and not a group to which individuals belong as members. So we're moving here from group theory in mathematics to a theory of groups. However, Nakai translates Cassier's function concept with the Japanese kino kai nen rather than kansu kaien, and distinguishes kino from kansu. Kansu and kansu are used in mathematics to refer to function equations, whereas kino, it refers to what something does or what it's for. The function kino of a window, what it does or what it is for, is to provide light, ventilation, and a view required for the house, whose function meets the needs of a purposeful activity of human dwelling. At this level, the functional concept of the window is a concrete universal. In the move to abstraction, the concept of the window becomes a functional complex of three elements. But this is an abstraction from the existential concreteness of actual windows. In the first case, the concrete window functions is orientated in someone else's, the last presentation, it was direction. And I've translated it as orientation, not because of Dewey or pragmatism, but because of Heidegger. Heidegger would talk about orientation of the things, and we'll come back to that in a second. Orientated to the purposeness of the human. In the second case, it is an unoriented functionalization in which the window is transformed into an abstraction. Through the sleight of hand, Nakai establishes the continuous disconnection of logic and life as the transformative mechanism of the historical event of worlding. Effectively, Nakai replaces Heidegger's concept of the Bewendtnis ganz as the being of the useful thing with the functionality of technical poiesis, thus grounding the historical world in nothingness rather than the finitude of Dasein. Now, whereas Hegel understood life from the standpoint of logic, Nakai understands logic from the standpoint of life. In the historical movement from the systems of slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, logic plays a peculiar role in the crisis that ensues in the collapse of each system and the reorganization by something else. Logic itself turns out to be a living ratio in the rupture. That is, it proves to be its own mediation. At each stage, rationality acquires new aspects that are unique to it, and at the same time, it retains all of these rationalities, the rationalities it previously possessed, by transforming them into something new. This, I would suggest, is how Nakai constantly goes from one theory to another theory to another theory, to Cassier, to Heidegger, to pragmatism. He's constantly transforming himself into something new. The reason of history is not the history of a transhistorical reason working itself out as it moves towards absolute knowledge, as in Hegel. Rather, reason itself is historically situated and conditioned. It is produced through the purposeful creative action and the means for this purposeful creative action, but a creative purposeful action without teleological end. And although actuality is an infinite actuality without teleological end, that is to say, without limits, its dialectical realization constitutes the unity of history. Again, the mediating moment that sways nothingness into being into nothingness, is the structure of the logic of technology. Now, how are we to understand this nothingness is beyond the scope of this paper. My instinct is to say that this nothingness here is not the nothingness of Nishida, but the nothingness of Tanabe. For Nakai, nothingness possesses a transformative function in the dialectic of history. The non-actuality is transformed into an actuality. But as the non-actuality is made actual, actuality harbors within it new non-actualities. The historical process is never complete, and the non-completeness of history is the product of a continuous repetition of negation. Nakai seeks to give logical expression to a non-completeness of an endless progressive progression of infinite actualities as a unified system, that is to say, completeness. Quoting Lennon, he writes, human thought goes endlessly deeper from phenomena to essence, from essence of the first order, as it were, to the essence of the second order, and thus proceeds infinitely. Each moment is defined by its schematizing the interdependence and wholeness of the whole process as part of the infinite process. The logic of the committee is the transformative mechanism of history, schematizing itself as a recursive process of infinite progress. The historical world is a dialectical process that schematizes itself as a process of infinite development while being one of regression. As the basis for making reality inevitable and complete, the whole always involves the principle of self-negation. The meaning of negation at each stage of logic constitutes in a structural way the framework of the logical mechanism of the committee. The logic of the committee brings all these rationalities to bear. It is the collective unity of a creative group of individuals working together in a creative process of decision-making as the production of history as history. The logic of the committee is the logic by which a group makes collective judgments and collectively acts in co-creating a collective history. The production of the historical world, like the production of journals, newspapers, team sports, and films, is a collective process of historical individuals working within history as history, and not the product of a single transhistorical ground. For Nakai, the power of collective resolution rests on the power of individual determination. This combination of the logic of the committee, logic of technology with the logic of production, and their connection to the logic of thought and the logic of debate culminates in the logic of praxis, which completes the basic model of the logic of the community. Oh, that's the end of it. Thank you very much.
Just a suggestion. I think it would have been nice at the end of the paper to return to the topic of beauty with which you began. And I say that for a specific reason. And this is not a question, it's just a personal reflection. Unlike all of you who are familiar with Nakai's writings, I came here just to learn something that would be of use to me, and needing to be convinced that I should take the time out to read what he wrote. And I think that your paper makes me see how a beauty is not just an addendum to philosophy or to his philosophy, but is an essential ingredient to his worldview. Much the same way as Kant's third critique is the bond that holds together his worldview. So you spoke of, you made a quote of his reference to Ariadne's thread as a bond that brings together disparate elements that need one another in order to exist. Ariadne's thread is not the right image. I mean, Theseus and the Minotaur, this is not really exactly right. But the point of the bond is really important. And I began to think that the pursuit of philosophy, to use Plato's language, is the pursuit of the true and the pursuit of the good, and the enjoyment of beauty. But it's more than just the enjoyment of the beauty as a means or an object of enjoyment. Beauty is kind of a copulative, a bond, like a soku, whereby nothing is true that does not lead to the good life. And there's nothing is good in life that is based on ignorance, or I should say invincible ignorance. I don't have any question opposed to this. I just want to say this is what your paper made me.
At the bottom of my paper, I do actually have a whole bunch of pages, and I had to cut for time. And I do circle back. But at the bottom of my paper, I wrote the importance of falsehood. It's not the falsehoods in the world that we need to overcome. It's the falsehoods of the world that we need to overcome. And exactly, what is true is always beauty. And if you've distorted it, that's the problem.
You presented these two sides as the self-critical clarity, insight, and revolt against disharmony, submission to oppression or victimization or the anthologies that support them. And this twofold practice of the pursuit of self-critical identity, clarity, and revolt against disharmony means that the tools and the techniques and social organization these means are not just means as implements for practice, but that they're informed and transformed and reformed by practice as well.
Yes.
So the bond of beauty is not simply aesthetic abstraction or movement from the world of the truth and the good, but it's what really brings them together.
Yes.
Can I ask a question that's a little bit of like, you said, I don't want to talk about this, but I kind of want you to talk about it. Is that, you said, we can understand the nothingness used by Nakai, not in terms of Nishida, but in terms of Tanabe, insofar as nothingness is a transformative function in the dialectics of history by which the actuality turns the non-actual into the actual. That sounds an awful lot like Nishida to me. So I was wondering why you think you find this kind of nothingness, particularly in Tanabe, if you could say just a word or two about that. I know that's not your main focus, but...
You say, I said, my instinct is.
Oh, okay.
And that means that my instinct is, I follow my instincts. And sometimes they lead me down dark roads, and sometimes they lead me to something interesting. The reason I don't feel I'm in a position because I don't know if I really fully grasp. I haven't had enough time to digest Nishida, let alone to really get a good handle on Tanabe and the differences between Tanabe and Nishida. And when you start speaking about nothingness in Nishida, I'd really like to know which text we're talking about. Because Nishida's concept of nothingness transforms greatly. And you are almost certainly referring to a notion of nothingness that's post 1939. And one of Nakai's comments was that he didn't think that Nishida ever really fully responded to Tanabe. And my instinct is that he has in absolute contradictory self-identity. He's not only reading Hegel, but underneath the hood, he is responding directly to Tanabe. And not in a way that says, oh, your critique was wrong, but in the sense of, I need to adapt and evolve my thinking. So the reason I don't want to I'm not in a position yet to really talk about it is because it's a moving target. And it involves two very complex moving pieces, Tanabe and Nishida. And anything I say would be, I'm already out of my league, and I've got someone who knows Tanabe so well over there, and I've got people over here who know Nishida so well. I mean, I would just be. Yeah, I would really be.
Okay, I respectfully withdraw my question. That's a fair point.
Sorry, I just don't think I have a good answer. I don't think I know if a good answer could be without going back to the text and doing a lot of discussion and getting a common understanding of a lot of technical terms, and as they move, I don't think it's possible to do it in this format. That's why I did give my answer though. I say what I think is Nakai's theory of and now it's up to everyone else to decide, is that Tanabe or is that Nishida?
Thank you for that. You said at one point, individual is a co-creative element of nature and collective historical world, and it made me think about nature as something creative. And when I think of Nakai, I don't necessarily think of it in those terms. But I'm not sure if I'm confusing nature and something like actuality. Like I think about Nishida or Miki, and actuality can be something creative, right, and generative. So I'm wondering how you understand something like nature for Nakai in these terms. Is it generative, creative, something? We've talked about it kind of as order in a number of different kind of ways, and I'm just curious kind of how you see this.
I think nature is, I actually, at one point, corrected myself when I was writing the text and said, the technology and the creativity is not in nature, it is nature. And so I would argue that my reading of Nakai is that nature is physis, is inherently is the creativity. It doesn't have creativity, it's something it does. It is the creativity. It is the appearance, the appearing. And this is where, then I would want to go back to the nature of Utsutsu and the structure of Utsutsu, and the word aru, which is translated as is a copula, but really is an appearing, something that's coming into being. And so it's in that sense that it is a perpetual immersion, appearing from the void. And this is the original idea of Utsutsu, is something that comes from the void. It comes into appearance. So for me, nature is inherently not just is inherently creative, but it is creativity. It is literally it's the Jesus in a non-metaphysical sense. There's nothing behind it, and there's no teleological aim, and that's what makes it infinitely creative. And so you use chopsticks every day, but then you need to step back and pick up the chopsticks. And that stepping back and then picking up the chopsticks sounds like you're just doing the same thing. No, now you are picking up the chopsticks, and you are, in doing so, opening up that world. And so it's in a very nuanced, every single action is creatively opening up the world. It's part of the world's opening up. And I at the beginning gave an example of, I said at the beginning, I said the artist creates beautiful things, but in so doing, they create different kinds of beauty. However, the spectator and the materiality of the work contribute to the creative process, and therefore can also be said to be artists. And I gave the black raku bowls. And the beauty of these bowls is that the artist has a role, it has to create the bowl, but the clay has a role. So does the lacquer. And then it goes into the furnace. The fire has a role. And nobody knows what the bowl is going to look like before it comes out. So all these elements are helping create it. And then when you take the bowl, the tea that goes into the bowl also creates it. And the mountain that created the tea is in the bowl. And then the bowl user must also be part of that creative process. And so it's a perpetually creating that world. All these elements are creative, or are artists creating it.
But according to your thought, so if every act is opening of the world, why do we need art? What is the difference between art and take chopsticks?
You mean high art, the stuff you find in museums? You don't need it.
I ask to you.
And my answer is if you mean by why do we need art? Then I'd be saying, well, what do you mean by art? Do you mean the stuff that's in museums?
What you are now talking about, Nakai, for example, you switch it from taking chopstick and aesthetic beauty and so on. So what is the difference from take the pen or produce raku, black ball, if there is any?
In essence, there's no difference except that one becomes performative of the aesthetic that's already there. I mean, some acts are obviously going to be more creative of a world than others, but I'm trying to resist going into a hierarchy and say, well, there are great artists, or that we've, Hegel, or with Heidegger, the age of great artists is gone, and I want to bring it back and say, no, that's a bourgeois and capitalist modern version of what art is. So I guess I would if I'm pushed, I would have to say I'm ready to give up that high art category.
No problem at all.
Oh, okay.
So to consider your thought, so if every act, also walking or sleeping, it means that the world whirls, then what is the role of poiesis in this as poetic, artistic?
Well, there's a difference between there's difference between the automated picking up of the chopsticks, and I said you step back and then you pick up the chopsticks, and there's a difference. And I mean, this is the difference that you find in Buddhism, right? You step out of the world and you come back into it, and then you do the things that are every day. But then you do them. This is the living of life. You do them here and now. If you're going to eat. If you're going to walk. If you're going to think. You're going to pick up the chopsticks. Pick up the chopsticks. And realize that you're creating a world. Participate in creating that world. That world's not a world that you think should be there. Don't pick the chopsticks up. So you become an active creator, much more.
So, David?
Thank you for your presentation. So, you are the title of your presentation contained the expression "art of living life" or something like that.
Yeah, art of living life.
Yes, art of living life. And so, if I understood your presentation correctly, so the beauty consists, in a sense, in this art of living life.
Yes.
But at the same time, so Nakai insists that there are three beauties, so like I told you, so natural beauty and technical beauty and the art of artworks. This scheme, how do you relate this scheme to the idea that beauty consists in the art of living life?
Different ways of living life. These are just different ways, different modes of living life, but they're all part of. I also said at some point that aesthetics, philosophy, and religion are the borderline between is blurred, and Nakai is picking up. In my opinion, he's taken up a taxonomy that's not necessarily inherently useful for him, and having to express things. And so he's fracturing this way of the art of living life. He's fracturing it into these levels and show how it filters out. And so those are the different ways that it filters out. I think this is from my own perspective is at the moment, my own perspective is that many of the Japanese philosophers of this time, Tanabe, Ishida, Miki, less Nishitani, are trying to articulate something in a language that's foreign to them. And they don't realize the extent to which this technical language that they're adopting comes with built-in content or built-in logics or built-in consequences. This is, I think, particularly true of Nishida. Up until 1930, Nishida is torturing himself and us with trying to articulate something using something that's inherently hostile to it almost. If I wanted to push it, and then he frees himself up from it. I think Nakai also is trying to adopt these categories and show what's the root of their value, how they're connected, and so the art of living can manifest itself in these different levels. I think that's where I would want to go. But as I said, I've been listening carefully, and I'm feeling very. I mean, everybody's read so much more of the Nakai than I have, and are more comfortable with it. So I'm feeling very much out of my depths here. So I mean, I instinctively, this is where I would want to go.
So this is my impression. So when Nakai depicts the history of Japanese aesthetic categories, like so mono no aware or wabi or ichi, then he focuses on the way of living, so to speak. So he didn't mention two artworks, but rather the way of living, so art of living life. So in this sense, your point convinces me.
And when he turns to speak about the Western tradition, the point is that these systems of aesthetics are accounts of ways of life, and as that way of life changes, the sense of beauty changes, the way of life changes, then the aesthetic, philosophical aesthetics, just to maintain this. We're using the same word twice. The philosophical aesthetic systems, Plato, Aristotle, etc., they change in function of how the way of life has changed, in function of the sense of beauty that has been opened up, the way of life. And so I think we have to be careful when is he talking and what's he talking about. So as third critique, the aesthetics comes out of an historically conditioned thing. He's saying, look at all the historical what's going on here in the material world and how this is creating this dichotomy. And this is what is great about Kant, that he's trying to synthesize this. But then it's, of course, the romantics are going to return, he says, to this idea of the will. And he repeatedly warns people about this, repeatedly. So the philosophical aesthetics is a reflection on a way of life that is based on beauty. That's how I would see the history working. This is why I don't see the logic of the committee as being necessarily a derivation from what he's been trying to do the whole time. Maybe new language, but at heart, it's the same. The Bodhisattva laugh is always there. I mean, it's what attracted me to the Nakai right off the bat. Every photo you see of him is laughing. And he wrote a thing on laughter in the middle of, Hiroshima. He writes about laughter and the importance of laughter.
So you can.
Yes, I thought I love the way you try to exemplify your thought, and for instance, the idea of chopstick. But I think to give justice to this sense of history that runs through most of essays, you could add to this example the fact that, okay, you've used your chopsticks, but the first time they're dirty. And if you let your chopsticks too long, then it's going to solidify around. And then your maybe chopsticks will degrade, or you'll have to use other chopstick or other tools, and it will, with the time, develop something else. Because it's not, I think, Nakai's view to only come back to the, it's not the Lebanon forest, it's not the return to primal tool or primal attitude. There is something in the object that has transformed a long time, I think. So I'd like to have your point of view, because if you just use the image of this chopstick, it's kind of the eternal return of the same, which I think is not in his case. What is interesting is that it evolves through time, and at his stage, you can, for instance, if you could imagine transparent glass chopsticks, maybe it could be a good image because he's talking a lot about glass. So how do you think you could, because I completely deal with this idea that you have kind of the aesthetic as you defined it, that is coming first, and then maybe the good and maybe the truth. I would put it like that.
But okay.
But do you think it's kind of always a return, to put it simply, always kind of the return of the same, to the kind of a primal approach to things? Or how would you, address the question of the complexification of the tools we have?
I'm not sure if this is going to respond to your answer, but it's what your question makes me think about. It's a problem I've been. If our subjectivity is configured and conformed, or configured and constituted through the mediation, through technological mediation, and we had a conference here a couple of weeks ago, and someone said this about Mickey, and so as the tools change, the subjectivity changes, and so does the world change. I thought, well, how do you know when your subjectivity has been transformed? How do you? one day you're thinking, your sense of self is this way, and then suddenly and I think you suddenly wake up and you're thinking this way. And so how do you know that this is not the self before? And I think there has to be a moment of kairos. There has to be a moment of the conversion. And this is a complete, and then the world just somehow the question really to answer the question for me, if I understand the question, it involves a problem of if you have a paradigm shift, then how do you know you've had a paradigm shift? When the world has changed, how do you know the world has changed? I've changed. How do I know I've changed? And fundamentally changed, not just.
Yeah, I know it's a crucial issue. I think we definitely have to separate those two. I mean, because when listening to you, I had the feeling, but then what's the difference between Nakai and Yanagi and Minge?
Nakai
and Yanagi Muneyoshi and Minge and Minge, the Minge movement.
It's like a folk craft movement in 1930s.
Oh. Well, again, I'm at the edge of my knowledge base here, but and also the knowledge of my Japanese. But it seems to me, if I understood correctly, that some of the words that, for example, Nishida, Miki, and Nakai use when speaking about technology and art and artworks and stuff, it does come close to this. It's language, and that this is very much a function of the debate about what is the nature of art, or what is the nature of Japanese art, and what is the nature of, and this leads to a whole field of which I do not have the expertise. I barely even know the field is there, let alone to be able to communicate on it. But I see that the problem is if you bring in a sort of an idea of art as being a reflection of the good rather than inverting it, this is problematic. The question is, does Japanese art have anything that can compare to the European standards of that express the beauty of the eternal? And well, the answer is no, because that's just not the way the aesthetic mechanism functions here. So, my instinct is to say that these issues are connected, but I don't have the knowledge base to even walk through it. Sorry.
I thought I can add something to your comment. It's interesting how religious symbolism changed as society changed, from herding animals, hunting and gathering. They have different kinds of religious symbols, to farming, fisheries, and so forth. But when they got to the technological revolution, religious symbolism kept in its primal form, its natural form. We don't use trains or automobiles or internet as religious symbols. No. But we have no trouble with herding sheep or fishing. No? These things feel natural to religion. Also, Jung once commented that he thought maybe that in modern dreams, people would stop dreaming of dragons and would dream of trains. But he said that almost never happens. Somehow people revert to the primal when it comes to the gut feeling of the psyche and religion in general. So maybe there's a kind of threshold. If technology goes to a certain point, mean, you see history and there's a paradigm shift. I think it's obvious. You see it around you. When you see a horse going down the road next to a horseless carriage, it's obvious that there's been a change. Or when you have a change of heart and all the people that you agreed with before all of a sudden disagree. I mean, I think we recognize these changes, but perhaps there's a threshold which we say, no, or we're going to stick with nature, with natural beauty. So even the fact that talking about technology and everything, you begin with a beautiful photo at the beginning saying you can't ever come close to that. But you know, the technological revolution stopped the creation of religious symbolism.
And I would even, go a little on a limb and suggest that part of what drove modern fascism was precisely to take images of mechanized technology, the train, etc., and infuse it with religious development. This is what Kishir would call the technique of myth. The weaponization of myth allowed it to take, one dimension and sort of project it or inject it into an image of technology. And this technology became something religious. But it wasn't genuine. And so I would even go as far as to say that therein lies some of the danger of that.
If Nakai would have said, he was what would have been, lenses, glasses were what to him was the most beautiful thing. And Utsusu begins with, his famous tale of the stone being polished so well that it becomes a mirror. That is a Buddhist tale. So he's not coming back to the earth.
But it's a stone.
It's a stone, very well polished.
It's a stone.
Patiently polished.
A stone.
And that
stone.
Through technology.
And then the next example is the echoes and coming back from the valleys. And he moves towards the lens. Again, I don't want to draw this dichotomy between technology is terrible and evil and fascistic. I want to say that my point was that in the transformation, in the development of a new sense of beauty, which would create a new sense of the fundamental, which would then open up a new life, historical life that would animate a historical world. That in that shift at that time, the danger is that technology could be used to create a closed world rather than an open world. And I think Nakai wants to root the technology back into nature rather than to make it a simulacra of it. And so I think that fascism is creating a simulacra and not the true thing. It's a simulacra of beauty that's very seductive. I think we still do that. The problem at the beginning of the 20th century is that we learned that the human being is configured by word and image. And once we understood that, we understood what the charlatans or what the shamans had always understood, the power of the symbol. And once we understood the power of the symbol, we could weaponize it. And we could create the symbols that have on the surface one meaning for people, but it would orientate them to act in different ways. And this is how otherwise good people are moved.
The lens is perfect. Your glass is absolutely transparent. That's what he says, to Suin Kabe in all those texts in the early 1930s. Which means if your technology, if your industry, if your carefulness, if your patience has been sufficient, individually and collectively, then you will be transparent and things will not adhere anymore. There will be no propaganda because people will be able to go through things perfectly. I mean, that's what he thinks. This is what I'm saying.
But there's in the scene of the you know, if I don't know if everyone's familiar with the story. It's you know, the king asks for two painters to paint something beautiful, and so the one painter does this splendid image of Pure Land and all its gems and beautiful. It's absolutely gorgeous. And the other painter doesn't even pick up his brush. He just sits there and polishes the wall as a base, and becomes a reflection. And of course, the king comes up and sees the first painting, and he's like, "Oh, this is gorgeous! It's beautiful! The phenomena of the Pure Land." And then he turns, and there's nothing there. And it's repeated 3 times. Why is there nothing? And so it's the image of nothing that's reflecting in him. And so it's not just simply a mechanism. The first one is a type of technology. It was a paintbrush that painted the Pure Land and gave him the illusion of the Pure Land. The other one gave him the Pure Land. It was the doorway to the Pure Land. It was the porthole to the Pure Land. It reflected nothing.
It reflected the.
It reflects nothing. It projects. It reflects him. It reflects the Pure Land painting and him in the Pure Land painting, but it projects nothing.
No.
And it's so you see that it's a technology that is not filling the gap. It's a projection of nothing, swaying nothing into being. And so it's a different mode of technology. The painter's brush is also a type of technology. And so that's one that closed off the system. And the other one is the one that's opening up the system. So this is why I'm trying to say that, you know, technology can be both ways. The fascist use of technology is the one that gives you the Pure Land image. And then you follow the Pure Land, you follow the image. And the other one is the one that sways nothingness into being and allows you to pick up the chopsticks. So I'm you know, I can't. I'm a very slow processor, and out of my depth here right now. But this is I still want to try to keep to the.
So as always, the fascists give the easy answer, right?
They give us the seductive answer. They give us the answer that makes us that corresponds with our own image. They engage in the imagination, the imaginary, and they reflect back our own self-image to ours in a way that seems to reinforce who we are or what we think we are, and then but what it does in the end is isolate us and insulate us in our echo chamber, and it alienates us not only from other people, other ways of thinking, but it alienates us from our own self and from the absolute. And so it understands Kant and says we can weaponize Kant. We can weaponize the imagination that produces the Vorstellung, the image, the schema, and the phenomenal presencing, and it uses that as a weapon to isolate us and insulate us in our own echo chambers, such that we can never transcend it. Exactly. And it's I don't think it's accidental that with that you see the same type of isolated and insulated suffering in youth who can be in a room full of other students and still feel isolated, insulated, because they cannot reach out to touch someone. They cannot reach out beyond the phenomenal to the other. And that requires, that's the whole point of the original paragraph. That, there has to be a breaking of the wave on the shore. I have to realize that I'm not this isolated, insulated capitalist ego, as he says, but rather that I am profoundly interconnected to my core, and creative of that interconnection, and cooperative in that interconnection, and to return us to that. And part of it is the laughter of the bodhisattva. I mean, that is a quote from Nakai. The laughter of the bodhisattva is the one who breaks the tension. It's the smile. It's the simple thing. I remember being in Tibet. I dropped what was for me not much. It was a $50 American bill. And I kept on walking, and people stopped me and turned me around. There was this old woman who, history and life had been cruel to her and marked the history had marked her. She barely walked. I thought she was 200 years old. Clearly abject poverty, returning this fortune to me. It's like, really? And I looked around at that moment, and I saw people who were oppressed beyond anything I'd ever seen or imagined as a university student who grew up in Canada. And what I saw was pride, smiles. Through the suffering, there was still a humanity there that I'd never seen before. And that's what I find in Nakai.
Okay, I think we can stop here.
Yeah.
And it's for Felipe. Now you have to smile when you take next time. Instead of the chopstick, your iPhone.
Yeah, correct.
So